Welcome back. Again, this is Father Helms, priest in charge of St. Monica's Anglican Church. In this next session, we're going to be looking at the doctrine of divine simplicity and how it relates to not only the liturgy in general, but specifically Holy Eucharist. I want to begin by first talking about what divine simplicity does not mean. If you were just hearing this term for the very first time right now, you might think that what I mean by that is that God is simple in the same way that kindergarten math is simple. Or if I gave you, as an adult, a 10-piece puzzle, you might say, well, that's simple. That's certainly not what we mean. The doctrine of divine simplicity is a theological position about the nature of God that has been in existence for thousands of years. And it very simply, no pun intended, means that God has no parts. Now, on the surface, that doesn't seem to be overly confrontational. When we think of humans having parts, or your dog or your cat's having parts, you look at the human and you say that human has hands, it has feet, it has eyes and nose. And God, at least as traditionally defined within Judeo-Christianity, certainly doesn't have a body, so God certainly can't have parts like that. But the doctrine of divine simplicity goes further, and it does certainly affirm that God doesn't have parts in the way that we as humans do, hands, feet, things of that nature. But it goes further and affirms that God doesn't have metaphysical parts. And it's that part that is certainly at times seen to be confrontational, or there's debate amongst it. Now, it might be helpful to have a little bit of analogy before clarification. If you've ever seen a prism, you look at a prism and you look out one end of the prism and you'll see that there are various colors of light. But we know when you look at the other side, you don't see that. You just simply see the ray of light entering the prism. Well, in many ways, that's how God is. When we see, for example, what we would say God's love or God's mercy or God's justice, we see on the one side of the prism those distinct attributes. But in reality, there's just God. And this is where we say that there are no metaphysical parts in God. And this takes us back to an earlier discussion where we said that God's essence and his existence are one and the same, unlike even angels. As classically understood, angels are at least distinct in that their essence and existence are distinct, but we said previously that that's not the case. And so when we say that God has no parts at all, metaphysical or physical, it certainly is a radical claim, because outside of God, we know of, certainly in our earthly existence, we know of no creatures like that, and certainly angels aren't like that either. And of course, there are those that disagree with that. What I think is at least interesting to note, though, is that when you look at the history of this doctrine, we see, what are often in the Western Church, the three big A-letter theologians all in agreement: Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas. And I think it's to be noted that when you see three absolutely monster theologians of the church, if you will, in agreement on this, and really it's in the Catholic tradition of the church, whether we mean Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, or within the Catholic strand of the Anglican Church, there's pretty much universal agreement. It's really only in, for the most part, within the Protestant aspects of Christianity this is found. And of course, that's not to say that there are not Protestants that don't agree with the doctrine of divine simplicity. One might make note of a very prominent theologian and arguably one of the top defenders of the doctrine today, Dr. James Dolezal, a Reformed theologian who is 100% in endorsement of that. But we certainly, I think, can see that the majority of those individuals who are very much opposed to it certainly do tend to lean in the Protestant arena of Christianity. One can think of preeminent scholars such as Bill Craig, Alvin Plantinga, Peter Van Inwagen, as individuals who, as Protestants, they don't have, in my estimation, the dogma of the church that's been passed down through thousands of years that they also are accountable to. And I think that is something that's important to note, that when we see that lack of uh, hinging back on the tradition of the church. And again, it certainly can't be disputed at all that it was not the universal agreement of the church for thousands of years, going back even before the church itself. We see in the Greek philosophers, Plato, most notably Aristotle, which is certainly where for St. Thomas Aquinas, he gets the most philosophical influence when he endorses the doctrine of divine simplicity. So I think it is pretty critical to see that there is this connection between the aspects of Christianity that are tied to the historical church that seem to universally endorse this doctrine. And though it might be confrontational in certain parts of Christianity, most notably in those aspects of the church that lean Protestant, it certainly has been the position of the church rather unquestionably until the modern era. And one might think of this statement that God has no metaphysical parts, and we're somewhat comparing God to a prism. That we see these different divine attributes, but really in reality, there's just God. That there's not a real distinction of God, like there's God's justice or God's mercy or God's love. There's just God. And you might think, well, that's rather obtuse. Maybe it's just some type of pontificating amongst academic theologians and philosophers, and it certainly at times might be that. But I'm going to make it very clear that it makes a monumental role in the liturgical life of the church. If you think about it for a moment, how many times have you been in conversation with a friend? Maybe it's a spouse, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, your parents, a close friend, and you just feel that that person's not paying attention. They're distracted in some way. Well, the reality is, as humans, because we have parts, that's a possibility. We get distracted in conversation. But because God has no parts, metaphysical or physical, whenever you are praying to God, you have all of God. It's not as if you are only speaking to part of God. You have all of God's attention. And again, it sets that relationship apart for us, and that we can have confidence in that relationship. We can feel love in that relationship that we can't amongst humans, because as humans, we do tend to get distracted. This also should result in having a very exalted view of God, because, and as part of this series has really tried to emphasize, God is not like us as creatures. Again, everything you know in the world has parts to some extent or another, but God doesn't. And because of that, he is a being unlike all other aspects of the universe. He is fundamentally and radically different, which is why we are called to worship him. It's why we have an obligation to worship him. Again, as humans, we don't have an obligation to worship other humans, because all other humans are just creatures. Even angels are just creatures. But God is radically and fundamentally different, such that you have an obligation to worship him. And lastly, when we come to Holy Eucharist, when we partake of the body and blood of Christ, in Jesus, fully God, fully man, that means that when you partake of the body and blood of Jesus, you are fully partaking of God. You let that sink in for a moment. Not just part of God. Again, you don't just get part of God when you partake. Again, you are fully partaking sacramentally of the body and blood of Jesus, and in turn, partaking of God fully. You can't have that. Even in the most of intimate human connections, you never get fully that other person. It's not possible, because as humans, we have parts. But with God, you have this unique, intimate connection when you partake of the body and blood of Jesus Christ in Holy Eucharist, that you are experiencing all of God in that moment in a way that you can't as a human in any other possible way. So though at times you might think of this doctrine of divine simplicity as just academic theologians pontificating about some obtuse distinction that doesn't really matter. It really makes a monumental difference, both in how it impacts you on a daily basis, that you have all of God when you go to Him in prayer, when you go to Him in the divine liturgy and partake of the body and blood of Jesus. You get all of God, because anytime there is God, it is all of God, not a mere part of God. Thank you.